Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The biggest obstacle confronting the dignity and citizenship of millions of Black Americans has not been racist demagogues like Alabama Governor George Wallace, nor white supremacists such as the Ku Klux Klan. From the Black freedom struggle after the '68 assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that galvanized the nation and world in 2020, the biggest threat has been and continues to be the police. That's the argument of one of our guests today on the Radical Imagination, Elizabeth Hinton, a Yale University professor of law, history, and African American studies, and one of the country's leading scholars on mass incarceration. In her recent book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s, she documents how America's morally destructive past finds itself, just as it did in 1968, at another political and moral crossroad. In her 2016 classic, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, Elizabeth showed how the police became a ubiquitous presence, surveilling, harassing, and intimidating Black communities at the precise moment that Great Society programs receded. The message was simple, she writes. Black people should get used to the police being part of their pickup basketball games, walks home from work, and family barbecues. Police surveillance of Black communities became normal, as did the deployment of military-grade weapons, tear gas, and armored vehicles. America on Fire continues the analysis of the deep roots of the current movement to reject the system of law enforcement that defines as the problem the very people who continue to seek to liberate themselves from racial oppression. Our other guest, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, is a frequent guest on the show and is one of the most forceful, prophetic, moral activists and preachers in the country. He co-authored with Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. His latest book, Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good, speaks poignantly and powerfully to the issues that America on Fire addresses in the movement to bring about love and justice in the world. So thank you both, Elizabeth and Jonathan, for being here. We're also thrilled to have you here, and can't wait to get started. So welcome and thank you again.
Oh, thank you. It's a great honor to get to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Let's get us started. Elizabeth, tell us how these two books of yours intertwine and connect, and give us like a thumbnail sketch here generally of your arguments, and then Jonathan, let's hear your response as well.
Well, first, Jim, thank you so much for having me on this show. I'm super excited and also honored to be in conversation with you and Jonathan. So, both books are about the process of criminalization, targeted criminalization in low-income communities of color, as federal policymakers and lawmakers at all levels of government divested from the welfare state in the last decades of the 20th century in response to the civil rights movement, right? And the first book is essentially a history of national crime control policies beginning in the Kennedy administration and during the Great Society, in the Johnson administration, when Lyndon Johnson called the twinned wars of both poverty and crime. And it shows, that in the end, the programs of the war on crime won out over the programs of the war on poverty. And Johnson introduced this kind of punitive dimension in national policy that subsequent policymakers seized upon, and set up essentially the war on drugs that we get in the Reagan administration. And of course, the 94 crime bill that was enacted under another president seen as liberal, of course,
Right.
Bill Clinton. So this book, the first book, really shows the way that these policies targeted communities of color in general, low-income communities of color, but specifically Black youth between the ages of 15 and 24, and that this was a process, right, that really unfolded over the course of the 70s and set up the explosion in prison populations that we see in the 80s and 90s. The second book really looks at the ways in which communities that were targeted for the expansion of police forces and the militarization of police in Black neighborhoods across the United States responded to the early deployment of the war on crime, and that was to fight back. There was this mass collective violence that we haven't really reckoned with within the literature, within the historiography, or as a nation, that happened, not just in Harlem and Watts and Newark and Detroit and the hundred so rebellions that occurred after Martin Luther King's assassination, but that was only the beginning. After King's assassination, after the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which Johnson signed into law in June 1968, which kind of marked the official launch and the extreme escalation of the war on crime, that's when we really begin to see rebellion, not just in big cities, but in smaller communities across the United States, not just in the Northeast, but also in the urban South, in the West, in the Midwest. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to Waterloo, Iowa, and Stockton, California, communities that we haven't really recognized and appreciated the impact of these new federal crime control policies and how the people where these policies were being targeted fought back against police violence, but also in a larger sense, the fact that the civil rights movement itself had not fully led to a transformation of living conditions. So, just like the grievances in the mainstream civil rights movement, these rebellions were rooted in calls for greater socioeconomic inclusion, an end to police brutality and white supremacist terrorism, and also jobs, decent housing, and access to educational opportunities.
Well, you've raised about 6 shows here. So Jonathan, take the ball. How do you respond to that with your own work and your attempts to transform our value structure and your own activism there?
Well, this history is so important because it names a dynamic that we are confronting as we try to rebuild the Poor People's Campaign that was launched at precisely the moment when this kind of backlash began. In some ways, you can say that the what we usually call the civil rights movement, the mass movement that led to significant legislative change in the 1960s, often that is framed as kind of the Emmett Till generation, right? The young people who sat in and who were on the front lines in SNCC and CORE and other organizations were the same age as Emmett Till. They had seen the kind of brutality that could be exercised on someone like them, and were inspired to try to change the systems of an unjust society and to bring that to the fore in the United States. And what I think your work does so brilliantly is shows how in the face of that kind of challenge, there was this major effort to change the conversation and to blame the very people who have been the recipients of so much systemic violence over and over again by criminalizing them. And in so many ways, that echoes the pattern that has existed through the history of this country, right? I mean, it happens after the Civil War, when during Reconstruction, Black folks for the first time have political power, they're immediately criminalized. They're immediately framed as dangerous and as corrupt by so many of the forces in that time. So a language to describe that, I think, is incredibly important in terms of empowering a generation that can say, wait a second, this is not our fault. There are systemic issues going on, and we need to organize in order to build power to change the system. So that's why I've found this narrative so helpful.
And it's directing us toward this age-old problem of blaming the victim. As you've written, Jonathan, to quote, you yourself personally have needed to go back and reread the Bible, keeping those people who were directly impacted by the ways it was twisted in mind. So that's similar to Elizabeth's point, isn't it? That we need a movement to reject the system of law enforcement that defines as the problem the very people who continue to seek to liberate themselves from racial oppression. And
well, as a preacher, I'll have to say the law and order narrative that you're naming was really adopted by many Christians, particularly white Christians, who associated law and order with God's order, and then used their own faith to blame people who they consider to be disorderly, and not, rather than what I think is a fairly straightforward reading of the scripture, which is to recognize that, from Pharaoh's empire in Egypt on through the New Testament, that God's people were always getting in trouble with the law, right? We're always in and out of jail. I mean, we're talking about Jesus, who was crucified as an enemy of the state. Here's a movement that was demonized by those in power because it challenged the established order of the day. So I think it's incredibly important to tie that biblical story to the kind of narrative that you're lifting up, that says that fight back that comes out of communities of human beings who are being dehumanized, that fight back has some legitimacy and some basic root in human dignity. So yeah, I think that's important.
But it's not just a religious right, of course, right? So the role of so-called liberals and social scientists in this, please get us onto that. As a social scientist, sociologist, I'm very interested in that. We played a role in perpetuating this as well.
Right. Well, I mean, just first off of what Jonathan's been discussing, I think, it's anytime people historically in this country, anytime people rise up for racial justice, the response is all, on the part of the establishment is always that this is chaos, this is criminal, this we need law and order. Yeah. And as soon as you begin to see the Brown v. Board and increasing civil rights protests and mobilization in the post-war period, conservatives are saying, this, we need law and order, this is criminal, and arresting people. And, by the time we get to the 60s, right, and Harlem's erupting after a police officer kills a 15-year-old Black high school student, many other liberals then begin to get on board and say, oh, well, this has nothing to do, this protest has nothing to do with civil rights. This is Johnson's language. This is criminal, period. And, this is a moment when the Kennedy and the Johnson administration invited social scientists to help them figure out how to address the problem of Black poverty. I mean, beginning in the Kennedy administration, officials saw demographic trends that were happening and became very concerned about the group who they labeled social dynamite, which were, of course, Black youth in the nation's cities. Cities were changing, had changed after World War II. Middle class and white people had begun to move to the suburbs, and you began to see concentrations of Black people and people of color in central cities. By that time, DC had come into a Black majority. Places like Detroit and Chicago were edging into, Cincinnati were edging into larger proportions of Black groups in those cities. And the Kennedy administration said, okay, if we don't do something, if we don't, these kids don't have jobs, if we don't make some kind of intervention, this quote unquote social dynamite is going to explode. Mm-hmm. Right. And so Kennedy enlisted host of social scientists, including Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Richard Olin and Lloyd Olin and Richard Cloward, to join the administration in figuring out how to combat these problems. And one of the kind of malignant analysis that were introduced in domestic policy during this moment was by Moynihan. And his analysis of Black poverty was that, well, Black poverty itself, we have to acknowledge the kind of history of racial discrimination, but he ultimately concluded that, Black poverty was the result of Black behavior. It was, in Moynihan's words, a tangle of pathology that had been passed down from one generation to the next. And so this analysis of Black poverty as a behavioral issue for Johnson officials meant, okay, well, we can actually then fight a war on poverty, a war on Black poverty relatively cheaply, because if Black poverty isn't tied to structural discrimination and is instead about behavior, then if we just give people job training programs and self-help programs, then Black poverty will be solved. And of course, that approach did not get to the root cause of the problem, which of course was socioeconomic, was rooted in systemic racism and exclusion, political and economic exclusion over generations and exploitation. But indeed caused that social dynamite that policymakers had worried about to explode. Through the remainder of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And this is what the rebellions were about, right? In the absence of concrete socioeconomic transformation and these pathological views about Black poverty and crime that have, that consistently led to, that idea about pathology then feeds itself into domestic policies shaped around policing and surveillance in low-income communities of color. Ends up leaving these enduring, as I said, malignant aspects of domestic policies that we're still reaping the consequences of today.
Diversions into benign neglect, as Moynihan put it. Now,
Exactly.
let me also, since you brought up Cloward and Moynihan, fierce opponents, and bear with me, it won't be that long. I have a couple of paragraphs here from an interview that Richard Cloward gave in 2000, shortly before his death, concerning his role as research director of Mobilization for Youth. I think it'll be very helpful to our discussion here and backs up what you've just said, Elizabeth. So we thought that gang delinquency was a poverty issue. This is Cloward. And the idea was to help people climb out of poverty by expanding opportunity. Opportunity was the hallmark. There were literacy programs and youth unemployment programs that had that objective. By 1963 and 64, the Kennedy administration, and then after his assassination, the Johnson administration, had a growing problem with the Black community. It wasn't just in the South. It was also in the big, as you said, northern city ghettos. The riots started in 1964. You could feel things boiling up. They had to respond in some way. Well, the civil rights movement had big demonstrations in Birmingham in the spring of 63. Then in August, the March on Washington occurred. Jobs and freedom, jobs and freedom. In other words, it was a focus on economic and politics. And here's to your point. The Kennedy administration did not have any economic problem for the ghettos, right? And to skip a little further down here, the point that he's making, the point Cloward's making, is trying to make, is that the anti-gang projects were made into anti-poverty projects, but they couldn't really be anti-poverty programs because the institutional sources of poverty were not something these projects could deal with. What could these projects do about the fact that the construction unions kept Blacks out? What the hell could the poverty projects do about situations in schools and the slum areas and the ghetto areas and so on? The gang project could not readily or really effectively promote institutional change.
Yep, he said it better. He said it a lot better than I just did, but that's right. Put another way, it's like, the war on poverty was not, despite the kind of lofty rhetoric behind it, right? It was not a job creation program. It was it offered job training programs, but what are you going to do if you train a bunch of people and then you don't have any jobs for them afterwards. What was needed was a complete overhaul of public schools, not remedial education classes. And unfortunately, the job creation program didn't come for low-income Americans. It came in the form of the war on crime and for police and eventually corrections officers.
That's where the money really went.
Right. That's the structural transformation.
Professionals, social workers, and so on.
Right. The structural transformation that did occur during this period, wasn't in the form of expanding opportunities and redistributing resources to people. It was in the form of creating, to modernizing police, modernizing law enforcement, and creating an entirely new industry of prisons and security measures.
It was a fraud. Most of these programs are really, basically, let's call it what it is. They were frauds. So that
jobs that get created are the jobs that you're describing within this, carceral system, and they're jobs that when you assume that role, you immediately assume the position of controlling people who are perceived to have a problem. And I mean, the sad reality is that people from these very communities have been invited into that role.
Absolutely. We're probably going to have next mayor here in New York, who is an ex-police officer, who is making sounds like, I guess Johnson here. He's going to bring back stop and frisk, and to a certain extent, and yet, so again, I think it's important what you're bringing out also, Elizabeth. This is a bipartisan effort. It's not just right-wing Republicans and centrist Democrats. So we've all been sort of captured by this narrative, which you and others, and certainly Jonathan too, are trying to change. So let me put in the other half of Cloward here, of Francis Piven, and gets into some of the points you're making, Elizabeth, I think, which is so important. Fran has written that the central role of power and domination, resistance and acts of rebellion and defiance play in history. This is the narrative we need to have more of. They are expressions of basic dialectic movement through which societies change or perhaps fail to change. So how does that perspective fit into either of your work and activism? Why should we? It's so important to refer, as you have, to these acts of urban violence as not as Black rebellions and not riots. Why is that so important? How do we begin to change this narrative?
Well, I'll just, from a like just complete terminology and historical perspective, I mean, part of why I call them rebellions is one, that's the terminology that many of the people who took this form of political action viewed their own actions, right? They, many people who were called rioters didn't view themselves as rioters. In my home state of Michigan, people don't refer to what happened in Detroit in 1967 as the Detroit riot. It's called the Great Rebellion. So so part of it is meeting people where they're understanding their own protests and their own actions. And the other is that in labeling this form of political rebellion as a riot in the first place, we've been stuck in this policy cycle where protests that are rooted in, again, systemic issues and socioeconomic demands are criminalized. And the solution then becomes not investing resources into those communities, economic resources, as Cloward was talking about, right? And instead, the solution becomes more police, which only then fuels the cycle and continues the criminalization. So how we assess, how we label these acts of protests is really, really important if we're going to actually break the cycle and address the conditions that make people feel as if they have no other recourse but to take violent action to demand their basic rights and to meet their basic needs.
And the cycle is police violence directed at the Black community, which is responded to with this rebellion, not the other way around.
Right. Police that are initiating the violence. That's another, cycle thing that's been misconceived, that that the precipitating incident, is always some violent police encounter. But that is related to a whole host of other grievances, of which, the policing, and again, we still see that we still see this today. We certainly saw it in 2020. Policing itself in many low-income communities of color that have been divested from and that lack basic resources is the most kind of tangible expression of systemic racism. And police officers are the frontline representatives of the state, where there are no other social programs in many communities but policing and surveillance.
Yeah, yeah.
In raw numbers, last summer we saw the largest mass demonstration for racial justice in the protests and uprisings after George Floyd's lynching. But in response to that, in state houses this year, we've seen just what you're describing, the criminalization of even the act of protest in some cases. I wonder, given that dynamic, in your historical perspective, where do you see the kind of language that is there you're describing from the Johnson administration on, in terms of opportunity? Where do you see that in the proposed social programs that we have in DC right now? I'd be curious of your read on this. I mean, one thing that struck me the other day was when Joe Manchin came out and was talking about how he doesn't want this to turn into an entitlement state. I mean, that sure sounds a lot like the language that was used in that era.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's, so for one, I think your point about the anti-protest bills is super important, because there's the policing cycle, the cycle of police violence and Black rebellion, but then there's also this larger policy cycle that the response to racial justice protests, and this we've been talking about this, right, whether nonviolent or violent, is criminalization. Mm-hmm. The 80-some protest bills that have been introduced in dozens of states since the George Floyd protests are really staggering. It's part of this larger project on the part of Republican state legislatures to limit the Constitution, to rein in the bounds of citizenship in a moment of new possibilities for racial justice. Like, this is a pattern that we've seen throughout U.S. history, the Reconstruction period, the Civil Rights period, and now it appears, perhaps at the precipice of the third Reconstruction, as you talk about, that we're experiencing a similar kind of backlash today. And I think that's related. So much of that backlash is rooted in both demographic shifts and also the extension of rights and the bounds of citizenship to new groups. And the response then becomes, well, only certain people, white people, right, deserve access to the certain benefits of citizenship and certain economic realms. And so that's where you begin to get this language about entitlement, about personal responsibility, where we fail to see the ways in which, the resources that we have in this country are very much shared, and that benefit, that some groups receive tons of government benefits that they don't even understand or label as such. It's just rooted in white supremacy and racism, and again, like, who should have access to certain benefits of citizenship and who should be excluded from them.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's so crucial. And one of the things that we've been working on in terms of fusion politics is the way that poor white folks in many rural areas of this country have been sold this narrative to the degree that they, have so bought the narrative that blames the other that they'll accept the narrative that blames them for their own poverty, right? So it's a lie that ends up catching you in your own lie.
Right.
So poor white folks in this country.
Right.
And what role does money play in all this? The multi-billionaires, the Koch brothers. I just did a show last week on it. The influence. And let me just talk about The influence of the ultra-right-wing groups that have infiltrated police departments and corrections across the country. I mean, that's just in the recent few days. Last time, the Times report, the mayor de Blasio wants officers who pledged loyalty to Oath Keepers fired. There's an article in the Guardian report that white supremacists and militias have infiltrated police across the United States in over 14 states. A couple of days ago, black firefighters and officials are speaking about racism in the New York Fire Department culture. I mean, it goes on. Another study shows that half of police killings have gone uncounted since 1980. So what about the ultra-right and infiltration into that criminal justice system and the role of big money, dirty money, influencing all that?
Well, I think, I mean, we've seen from Bacon's Rebellion onwards, right? I mean, it's always been the interest of elites in this country to keep the majority divided along arbitrary things like race, like racism. And as Du Bois talks about, race has been used as a psychological wedge to prevent solidarity among poor Black, brown, and white people who have far much more in common and whose strength in numbers and power could potentially lead to a major transformation that would bring about the necessary redistribution of resources that so many people see as really the only way forward in this country. So I think that's part of it. I mean, it's in the interest of the Koch brothers to keep people divided along lines of race, to keep people thinking that certain people are leeching off of one pot of the tax pie and all of the other arbitrary divisions, that such things like critical race theory, that's the new thing that's going to become, certainly part of the conservatives' election platform in the upcoming midterms, that really understanding and reckoning with the true history of this country, the history of exploitation and oppression, and the way that racism has always, and gender exploitation has always centered that. They don't want to teach that and are now making it part of the culture wars, right? So, all this does is keep this big business, keep elites in power. I mean, I think with respect to the ways in which white supremacists themselves have deeply infiltrated the military, law enforcement, firefighters, as you mentioned, Jim. Again, that's been true historically. I mean, we know the enmeshment of police departments and the complacency of police departments and lynching historically. The ways in which law enforcement authorities sanctioned and allowed for violence by white mobs to take place against Black individuals and Black communities as a whole. Tulsa is an example of that. So in many ways, we shouldn't be surprised that white supremacists continue to play a prominent role in many of our police departments and in our military.
Jonathan, you are so intimately involved in the front lines, listening through your efforts to organize people around fusion politics. You're listening to what people are telling you. Tell our audience, how do you deal with that? How do you try to get them to see what Elizabeth has just been, telling us? How do you get them to understand how they've been hoodwinked in a sense, and how they continue this false narrative to their own detriment as well?
Well, the point you were making about the way culture war issues are used as these wedge issues. I mean, this is what's happening at with the school board confrontations around masks. You mentioned critical race theory. These are manufactured controversies, right? These are not things that people sat around the kitchen table at home, weighing the issues that are most pressing on their life and said, we're going to have to go down to the school board because this critical race theory is really disrupting our children. No, these people who have incredible amounts of money have invested in these organizations like Turning Point USA. They create these kits. They mail these kits out to people. They tell them, that there's this ominous threat, and it's always a threat to your children because they know people care about their children. And it's playing on these tropes that have been repeated over and over again. So yes, the cultural wedge issues are going to continue to be pushed. And I think the only counter to that is to build solidarity around these kinds of common good issues that really can make a difference. And it's why I think, on the other side, we have to push back against this narrative that's coming up in the conversations about the social spending bill in DC that sort of pit, moderate versus progressives. I've been listening to reporting, from Capitol Hill that keeps saying, progressives want this, $3.5 trillion in spending, and the moderates are trying to pull the other way. But that's not even a true description of what the conversation has been. If you wanted to be honest about it, the progressives proposed $6 trillion in spending in the Senate Budget Committee. Bernie Sanders chairs the committee. They had $6 trillion on the table. The leader of the Democratic Party, the president of the United States, is the one who proposed the compromise of $3.5 trillion on a broad agenda that most Democrats are on board with. And yet there's constantly these narratives that try to paint programs that would help everybody as extreme, and any effort to tax reasonably wealthy people in the way that wealthy people in every other industrialized country in the world are taxed, it's painted as extreme because that is the interest of those people who want to hold on to their money. So I think building solidarity around those things, lifting the voices of people who can testify to the fact that, this isn't just some people asking for a little bit more. This is the kind of desperation. There are communities that are living in desperation. 140 million people in this country are poor or low income, which is why before COVID, 700 people a day died of poverty in this country, and they continue to die of poverty. And that doesn't happen because, as we've been talking about, people have made bad choices. It happens because we have a system that simply allows poverty and normalizes it.
Elizabeth, does that sound like we're making some progress from the 60s? Are we gonna? Well, no, I mean, in other words, are we gonna be listening to this? We heard this stuff also back in the Great Society times, but is it gonna click this time?
I mean, we have to hope that it will. I mean, I guess time will tell. But what I'm not seeing, and what's discouraging about even these debates about the infrastructure bill is somebody putting forth a kind of bold vision, and this from maybe a surprising source, and that's the Kerner Commission. I mean, the Kerner Commission in '68, Johnson called the commission during the rebellion in Detroit to evaluate the causes of the violence and come up with solutions. And of course, the Kerner Commission recognized that the rebellions were socioeconomic in nature, and that throwing police at the problem was not going to get to the root cause, that these rebellions would continue, that inequality would increase. I mean, they famously said the nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And what's significant about this commission is that it was a presidential task force. Yeah. They said, okay, if the federal government's serious about addressing these issues, we've got to go well beyond the war on poverty. We have to make a massive investment, essentially a Marshall Plan for American cities, and completely overhaul institutions that were failing and that were under-resourced. And Johnson, found that the report too radical. He never commented on it publicly. And, the transformation again came in the form of the war on crime. Unfortunately, we're not seeing, there's not a similar, in this moment, from a kind of executive level committee. We're not seeing that kind of bold vision happening. We're not seeing that kind of bold vision from the Biden administration. And I'm certainly not saying that we need another commission. I actually think, continuing to call these commissions and task forces continues to kick the can down the road. All we need to do is go back to what the Kerner Commission said, which is that we need a different set of investments in these communities. It's really common sense. So we know what the problem is. I think one of the things that's been exciting to see over recent years, but particularly during 2020, is a growing awareness and outrage over the problem of systemic racism, the historical roots of racism and class inequality, and new generations of people rising up, new coalitions forming, who want to see their government make a different set of investments. And so, if we are in a similar moment, I think it's going to be carried by those coalitions and by those rising generations.
And by the moral transformation that gets in, Jonathan, Reverend Barber is off returning from the Vatican. We were talking before the show. Tell us a little about that effort.
Well, religious leaders from around the world have gathered to say some things clearly that are right in line with what we're saying here today, namely that poverty doesn't have to exist, that it's a political choice, that governments have a responsibility, and they have both the resources and the means to address poverty. So I think that kind of moral narrative is critical, but along the lines of what you were saying, Elizabeth, it's also critical that we have a concrete form for that to take within our political system. And so I am grateful that we have several score members of Congress who've backed the third Reconstruction resolution in the House. And we are building a narrative within the political system that says we can address these things, we can do big things, we can invest in addressing systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the lies of a war economy and the lies of distorted religious narratives, all within a sort of omnibus vision for a major reconstruction of the system as it exists. Now, do we have a political majority that's ready to back that right now? No, but if it exists in reality, then I think we can build power towards it, and we can challenge people who are in office to tell us whether they're for that or whether they're not. And I think that's what allows for people in local communities to build momentum around sending people who would support that kind of vision.
Do we have the time, though? Time is running here. And as you point out, Elizabeth, peaceful protests alone have rarely been sufficient to garner the national political attention or to force policy transformation. Again, I totally agree with what, Jonathan, you're saying here. But again, how would you respond to what Jonathan just said and the need to have more than just these peaceful protests, because that has not been enough historically.
It hasn't been enough historically, but I would hope. I think Jonathan's point about we know that most people in the United States support these kinds of policies. In fact, and there's a minority that is seeking to take over the government and create what looks like an authoritarian regime to completely erode democracy, because that's the only way that they can keep power. So, at this point, I do think that that most people have the kind of society, the future society that we've been talking about on our side, that this is what most people want. And I think it's only going to continue to be more so, especially as this country becomes yet more diverse and white people become the minority. And I would hope that that these kinds of changes can come about peacefully, that they can come about through direct action protests, that they can come about through political education, that they can come about by people mobilizing to keep pressure on policymakers, by lawsuits. I mean, the tactics that have worked and that have steered the civil rights movement historically. But it is also true that revolution, as Malcolm X pointed out, is often bloody, and that it is violent protest that often gets policymakers' attention, and that has played an important role in moving the needle on racial justice historically. So we have seen a kind of balance where nonviolent and violent protests kind of bounce off of each other to drive history forward. And it may be that that again, if in the absence of changes to people's concrete living conditions, in the absence of people feeling as though they're being included in society and not marginalized and warehoused in a prison, if people feel they have no other recourse but to take violent action, then because of the policies that have been put in place, then these rebellions will inevitably continue. So it's really the question of, those of us who want to bring about the changes, what are we willing to do to keep the pressure on our elected officials? And also, fostering care and love within our own communities, right? Because that's another key element to sustain any movement. And then what are policymakers going to do to finally realize some of the fundamental founding principles of this country, and that is really equality, which has never been a guiding policy principle. Only 2 brief times during the Civil War and then during the Civil Rights Movement, and quickly, we saw mass repression following those initiatives.
I'm so glad you brought on those terms, care and love. Not to be Debbie Downer here, but for almost since the 1930s, the great majority of people have wanted a one-payer health system. So we're approaching almost 100 years of that. On the other hand, we've got a few minutes more to go. And I'm so glad, again, you brought those terms into this discussion, care and radical love. What does that mean? Because we are beginning to grasp and understand that this cycle of violence that we're talking about will never end. The search for punishment, revenge, retribution, it never ends. So the only thing can break that is transformative love and caring. How's that for a segue? Jonathan, right? That's the prophetic tradition. Important.
That's the vision of beloved community. I mean, ultimately, I think you're touching on what gets beyond nonviolence as a tactic to, the real way of life that it invites us into. I'm happy to have the tactical conversation with anybody who's engaged in struggle, and I completely understand people who are so pushed against the wall that they only see violence as an option. One of my mentors here in Durham was one of the most militant leaders of the movement here in the 1960s, and she told me that things didn't change in Durham until they got hot. By which she meant, you really had to put the pressure on, and in this case, they set tobacco warehouses on fire in order to make clear, that the economic system was going to change, or it was going to be ended by the people whose backs it was sustained by. So I completely get that. But in the struggle, the question is, can we imagine the possibility of a future together? And that's where that hard work of building community with one another, of listening to one another, of telling our stories and hearing across these historic divides, all these wedge issues that have been used for so long to divide us, it makes it almost impossible for us to see one another sometimes. And so, those moments of shared meals, music together, dancing together, of joy, are essential to building the kind of community that I think makes it possible to even continue the struggle. So you're absolutely right. We got to have some vision of beloved community if we want to have a multi-ethnic democracy, because if we can preserve even our voting rights, then it's in order to get us to a place where we can share the society together with people who come from very different backgrounds.
Amen. And in the last minute, Elizabeth, let me give you the last word on this to take us out. Your last thoughts. I mean, your thoughts on the show here.
It was just beautiful for me to hear Jonathan elaborate on beloved community, because, you know, that's what the goal is, right? I mean, that's, you know, and I think that's why history is so important, and that's why I do history, you know, and I hope that my research can contribute to understanding the past in order to better see where we're at in the present, and then envision and create a different future that will foster that kind of beloved community. That's what I want. That's what I want for my children and my great grandchildren, my great grandchildren. That's what I do. And, you know, we may not see it in our lifetimes. As you said, Jim, it might take a long time, and time is not necessarily on our side here, but I believe we have to believe that ultimately we will bring that about. We have to.
Beautifully spoken. I can't say anything more than that, and other than thank you both so very, very much for this. I mean, it seems like we've been only talking 5 minutes. We could go on and on and on, but thank you so much. I think this has been very enlightening and a beautiful show. It was just my honor to have you both on. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks. This was wonderful.
Right. Peace and love. All right. Thank you so very, very much again. This is Jim Vrettos, your host on The Radical Imagination, and we'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.